Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. Michael Hunter is reportedly not going to pursue his IBF final eliminator against Filip Hrgovic, according to Kevin Ioli. New IBF rankings due out soon, but based on last month's list, next in line would be Hrgovic versus Joseph Parker. Winner would be the mandatory challenger for Anthony Joshua. There's more going on here than meets the eye.
Why would he do this?
Eddie Hearn won the purse bid for this match. You have to understand that. This would have been Michael Hunter's opportunity to return to the shores of Matchroom and DAZN. Yet he has willfully decided to go the other way based on these reports. Kevin Ioli says, sources tell that Michael Hunter is not going forward with the bout with Filip Hrgovic. Plans are to go in another direction and should be determined soon. For a perspective, for good measure, we all know that the IBF is the sure route to get yourself a title shot. And that's basically saying that Michael Hunter could have been just one fight away from getting a crack at the winner of Joshua versus Fury, the biggest money fight around. And for some inexplicable reason, based on these reports, he's decided to go in another direction when he's just one fight away from getting to that brass ring. You ask me what I think is going on here, and I'll tell you. I'm just giving it to you straight, because it's the only way I know how to give it to you. There's only one stable of fighters that have a reputation for making these kinds of counterintuitive moves. There's only one stable of fighters that exhibit this pattern of behavior, walking away from multi-million-dollar opportunities. There's only one stable.
Guys that favor the path of least resistance.
Weeks ago, on a live stream, I spoke to Mark of Unrivaled Boxing Talk, and he told me that, he was on Instagram, something like that, a live stream.
Michael's stream.
Michael Hunter's live stream. And he asked Michael a question. He asked Michael whether or not he'd been dealing with the PBC. I vaguely recall Mark telling me that it looked like Michael saw the question.
He fucking saw it.
Looked like Michael saw the comment, chose not to answer. In light of this recent news, Michael Hunter, who's just one fight away
from the big one,
had a shot for all the marbles, all the belts, with the winner of Joshua versus Fury by way of the IBF, who we all know take their mandates and their mandatory challengers. They take them very seriously. The IBF is the sure route to get yourself a title shot because they're not going to jerk you around. Michael is just one fight away from becoming the IBF's mandatory challenger. All he has to do is get through Hrgovic. Hrgovic, who seems very formidable, but does not yet have the heavyweight resume that Michael Hunter has amassed. Hrgovic hasn't been in there with guys like Alexander Povetkin, Alexander Ustinov,
Sergey Kuzmin.
Michael Hunter has. Michael Hunter only has one recorded professional loss, and that was at the hand of Alexander Usyk in the cruiserweight division. That being said, there's no shame in that. Michael Hunter has done very well for himself since then and amassed a very respectable heavyweight resume. Moreover, Michael Hunter was a live animal in that Filip Hrgovic fight. That was a winnable fight for him.
He wasn't in over his head.
Or he wouldn't have been. And with Eddie Hearn having won the purse bid for that fight, you would have thought that the wheels were moving along and that fight was an eventuality. That being said, if Michael Hunter has decided to go in another direction, I suspect it's because he's in bed with the PBC and they have other plans for him. Other plans that won't get him the kind of money that he could make if he makes it past Filip. Other plans that don't include challenging the winner of Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury.
Think about it for a second.
What other stable of fighters do you see regularly making these counterintuitive moves on the precipice of a big fight or a big payday? Think about it. Luis Ortiz turning down the Anthony Joshua fight. Adam Kovnowski turning down the Anthony Joshua fight. Jermall Charlo turning down a $7 million payday to unify titles with Demetrius Andrade. Gervonta Davis turning down a multi-million-dollar opportunity to unify titles with Tevin Farmer in a fight that he could have won.
What other stable of fighters do you see doing shit like that?
I think Michael Hunter is in bed with the PBC, and it just hasn't been announced yet. And that's how you can explain this move. That is how you can reconcile it, because look at how it's being reported. They're saying it's Michael Hunter that's walking away from this. They're saying it's Michael Hunter that's going in another direction. They're not saying it's Philippe. They're saying it's Michael.
Michael has been a network and promotional free agent for a while now.
The PBC, they might be in the market for one or two more heavyweights, since their prize stallion took that shellacking in February of last year at the hands of Tyson Fury. Their prize stallion that, you know what? He hasn't come back yet.
Somebody's got to fill the void.
And that somebody could be Michael Hunter. You ask me what I think is going on here, and I think Michael Hunter's in bed with the PBC, and I think in a short amount of time we'll receive that confirmation. When we do, we'll talk more about it. But if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, that's what I think. That's what I think is going on. Michael walked away from the Hrgovic fight because he struck some kind of deal with the PBC. And just in keeping with the theme of all things PBC, per a tweet from Mike Kopinger, the numbers are in for the Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Chris Arreola fight per Mike Kopinger's sources. The Andy Ruiz Jr. versus Chris Arreola PBC on Fox pay-per-view generated in excess of 125,000 pay-per-view buys at $49.99, and the final number could approach 150,000. The fight was Ruiz's first fight since a series of bouts with Anthony Joshua on DAZN. You know, the difference between 125 and 150,000 is about 25,000 pay-per-view buys. That's a lot of buys. That's a lot of money. But I'll go ahead and round up. I'll go ahead and make a generous estimate that the pay-per-view did 150,000. What you're looking at is about 7 million.
7.5.
At a price point of roughly $50. $7.5 million. Now, if you have any idea, if you have the foggiest fucking clue how these things work, you'll know that
The money.
all 7 million don't go to Andy Ruiz.
Of course not.
The PBC, Fox, they're not staging pay-per-views for the sake of staging pay-per-views. They do these things with the intention of receiving some kind of a return. They do these things with the intention of making some kind of a profit. Thus, if the pay-per-view bought in as much as 150,000 buys, that would top out at about 7.5 million. And all of that 7 million ain't going in Andy Ruiz Jr.'s pocket.
If it even makes that much.
I say if because Mike Kopinger's numbers, they're all over the place. In excess of 125, but could top out at 150.
That's a difference of 25,000.
Andy Ruiz Jr.'s guaranteed purse for the fight was something to the tune of $1 million. $1 million up front, $1 million guaranteed.
He got offered more than that to fight Dillian White.
4 times as much. Did you guys forget that last year there was a $4 million offer on the table for Andy Ruiz Jr. to lock horns with Dillian White? And instead of taking him up on that offer, he chose to sit out the rest of the year, the rest of 2020, where Dillian White ended up fighting Alexander Povetkin and ended up getting knocked out by Alexander Povetkin. That could have been Andy Ruiz Jr. that upset Dillian White. Instead, he chose to leave that money on the table, sit out the rest of the year, so he could pop up in 2021 against Chris Arreola and get dropped.
Stop me when I tell a lie.
Shouldn't even say that he sat out the rest of 2020 because he didn't fight in 2020. I should say he sat out the whole of 2020 when there was a $4 million offer on the table for him to fight Dillian White, who he claimed didn't want the smoke.
That turned out to be bullshit.
I want you to understand something. I'm not going to accuse Andy Ruiz of being afraid of Dillian White. What I will say is I think that he being a PBC fighter, and those who handle his career, those who might make the decisions for him, this would be yet another chapter in the same book. The same book that details the counterintuitive decisions made on the behalf of PBC fighters. We just talked about this with Michael Hunter, who I suspect has inked some kind of a deal with the PBC.
PBC guys regularly turn down fights.
Like how Andy Ruiz Jr. turned down that $4 million offer to fight Dillian White last year. So what you have to ask yourself is, was this smart business? Did he make more money fighting Chris Arreola, or even the same money fighting Chris Arreola that he would have made fighting Dillian Whyte last year?
Because we know he didn't make $7 million.
Not based on these numbers. Hell, $7 million is based on the pay-per-view reaching 150,000 buys. For all we know, these numbers are being exaggerated, and it's actually just 125,000. And if it's 125,000,
Then it's 6.2 million.
so regardless of which number you want to go with, 6.2 or 7.5, what you then have to ask yourself is whether or not you think Andy Ruiz got
4 mil.
out of that 6 or got 4 out of that 7.
I don't think he did.
Fighter don't get 100% of what the pay-per-view generates. Fighter don't get 75% of what the fucking pay-per-view generates. Hell, some instances, I don't think the fighter gets 50% of what the pay-per-view generates. And what we see here, based on these numbers, is that this pay-per-view either generated 6.2 or 7.5 million. And out of those millions,
Do you think Andy got 4?
because that's what he would have got, win or lose, had he fought Dillian last year. There's that to consider, and then there's time. That's right, time. The time that you don't get back. If Andy would have took that fight last year, he would have made himself $4 million in the year of 2020. As it stands, he didn't make himself anything because he didn't fight. And what you don't get back is the time. He passes on the Dillian Whyte fight, sits out for over 12 months, a year, so that he could pop back up in 2021 and make less money than what was on the table for him the year before. These are the counterintuitive moves that I'm talking about.
This is how PBC fighters navigate their careers.
At minimum, what we can say is that Andy Ruiz Jr. willfully walked away from a Dillian Whyte fight to take on a lesser-ranked fighter for less money.
Stop me when I tell a lie.
At minimum, we can say that much. At minimum, we can say that, for whatever reason, Andy Ruiz Jr. and his team didn't want to know. Dillian Whyte is a fighter that is constantly berated in some circles. There's a lot of guys out there who think he's entirely beatable. Well, maybe you think he's beatable, but Andy Ruiz Jr.'s team, they must have thought something else, because if they thought he was beatable, they'd have took that $4 million, knocked him out, and then went back to the PBC side of things.
They would have, but they didn't.
They didn't want to know, and you can make of that what you will. Other news, per tweet from Mike Kopinger, once again, ran into Eddie Hearn and Keith Connolly. Eddie says he'll be making a multi-million-dollar offer to Top Rank and Joe Smith Jr. for a 175-pound title fight with Daniel Jacobs in the fall on DAZN. Big New York fight. Hearn is willing to do it on ESPN if it makes more financial sense. Jacobs, a former champion at 160 pounds, now competing at 168 pounds, would move up to 175 for a chance to become a two-time champ. Smith won his first title in a war with Maxim Vlasov last month. The Long Island native has steadily improved and is a big puncher. I wouldn't dismiss the possibility of this fight happening, I wouldn't. We know what Bob Arum's plan is. His plan is to have Joe Smith Jr. meet up with his other guy, Artur Beterbiev, sometime in the fall, conditionally at Madison Square Garden. But an excursion with Daniel Jacobs for Joe Smith Jr., there's enough time still there that perhaps it could happen towards either the end of the summer or the beginning of the fall, still leaving enough time for the winner of that fight to unify titles with Artur towards the end of the year.
Jacobs versus Smith in late August or early September.
The winner of that fight could face Artur in December. Keynotes. Eddie Hearn said a multi-million-dollar offer. Multi-millions for Joe Smith Jr., the common man. Golden opportunity for him. And if the money is right, we know Bob will let it happen. That's what he did with Jose Ramirez and Maurice Hooker. If the money and the conditions are right. Given how Daniel Jacobs looked, against Gabriel Rosado, Bob might actually let Joe do it.
Danny ain't looked like no world beater against Gabe.
That was at 168 pounds. The fight with Joe, that'd be at 175. I know that Joe didn't look his best against Maxim Vlasov, but I can only tell you now what I told you before. Maxim is a naturally bigger guy than Joe. He's basically a cruiserweight on a diet. He's a much bigger guy than Joe, and he's very much a bigger guy than Daniel Jacobs. So don't let Joe's last performance fool you into thinking that he's not a serious and grave threat to Daniel Jacobs. Yes, he is.
Joe didn't look good against Maxim.
But Daniel Jacobs is nowhere near as big a guy as Maxim. Don't let what Maxim did in there fool you into thinking that just anybody, any old buddy, is going to walk in there and do that to Joe Smith Jr., Danny Jacobs included. Recent events indicate that Daniel Jacobs is back with his longtime trainer, Andre Rosier. I have no doubts that that performance that he put on with Gabriel Rosado, that stinker, that likely has a lot to do with why he decided to go back to Andre Rosier. Because with Andre Rosier in his corner, Daniel Jacobs has shelled out some of his career best performances. And he's likely trying to get back to his winning ways on the heels of that stinker that he put on with Gabriel Rosado. For some reason or another, they think Daniel's got what it takes to
Beat Joe?
compete as a light heavyweight. And I think that they might be taking on too much too soon. It's not that Daniel doesn't have the frame to carry the weight at 175 pounds. He actually does.
He can fit right in over time.
But the key words there are over time. If what he's trying to do is move up from 168 to 175 for Joe after having stunk up the place with Gabe, well, that really does favor Joe Smith Jr., and I've no doubts that that's how the people over there at Top Rank are looking at it. Eddie says he's willing to send Daniel over there to Top Rank if it makes more financial sense. That increases the probability of the fight coming off. So with Matchroom still negotiating terms on Daniel Jacobs' behalf, offering to stage a fight for him, I guess it's safe to assume that the relationship between Daniel, people over there at Matchroom, it's not all the way over.
Not yet.
Jacobs versus Joe Smith Jr. is a very intriguing fight, and I think on the face of it, you'd have to favor Joe.
Brooklyn versus Long Island.
Don't dismiss the possibility of this fight happening. Remember, the key words here: multi-million-dollar offer for Joe Smith Jr. You know what the fight purses were for Gvozdyk versus Beterbiev? Just $1.5 million apiece. $1.5 million. Eddie Hearn is talking about offering up a multi-million-dollar deal for Joe to defend his title against Danny in what can only be described as a winnable fight for Joe. You remember what he did to Jesse Hart? Jesse Hart, like Daniel Jacobs, who moved up from 168 to 175. That's what Danny's talking about doing.
Those are the circumstances for this fight.
I think given those circumstances, the people over there at Top Rank, they'll be listening. People over there at Top Rank, they might actually let Joe go over there to DAZN for a one-off, the same way they let Jose Ramirez go over there for a one-off, because they'd be confident that this version of Daniel Jacobs ain't got nothing for smoking Joe Smith Jr.
On the premise of that Ramirez fight, they might actually let him do it.
Jose got a career-high price, a career-high payday to go over there to DAZN for that one-off. He made something like $4 million. If DAZN, Matchroom, if they're offering Joe something like $2, $3, maybe even $4 million to defend his title against little old Danny Jacobs, I mean, so long as it's more than just $1 million, they might actually let Joe do it. Because need I remind you, the purses for Gvozdyk versus Beterbiev, they weren't astronomical. Both of those guys got 1.5 apiece. Joe might stand to make more than that defending his title against Daniel Jacobs.
Daniel, who just looked pretty ordinary against Gabriel Rosado.
So all those things in mind, and that being said, this fight is a genuine possibility.